for land-based gambling, where the pokies are back opening, there's definitely been an uptick in spend, quite a significant uptick in spend, which indicates, depending on which way you want to put it, pent-up demand or binge gambling. So there's all sorts of issues there. But what I'll do today is mainly take you through gaming and gambling. And I guess the first thing that I would note that I think is always interesting around gambling, particularly for ethnic communities, is that there's this sort of story out there that Australia is a nation of gamblers. And therefore that part of being an Australian is to gamble. Now, in fact, that's actually not very true, particularly if you think about a gambler as being someone who gambles on one of the major gambling forms and pretty much does it pretty regularly. Then the percentage of people doing that is probably maybe slightly more than the amount of people that smoke, but not a lot more than the amount of people that smoke. It's probably around 1 in 5 people sort of gamble in that way, maybe a bit less. So we wouldn't really call Australia a nation of smokers anymore, but we're happy to still talk about Australia being a nation of gamblers. Now, one area where there is an issue, though, is how much money we spend on gambling. So that small percentage of people spend a lot of money on gambling, and that means there's a lot of harm that is done in that gambling that takes place. But I think it's always important for new migrants to not be picking up that myth, particularly their children, who we know the first generation are often very keen to fit in. And so if they think that gambling is a part of fitting in, they might. But for example, sports betting, which all of us think is massive, and we see heaps and heaps of advertising for it, of course, it's wall-to-wall advertising. A study the foundation did a few years ago showed that there was more advertising, 5 times, I think, more advertising for gambling than there was for alcohol. But the percentage of people that are actually betting on sport is about 6% of the population. So the rest of them aren't. So again, there's a false normalisation there, or a false perception of normality. Anyway, I'm digressing too much now, so I'll go to the actual today's presentation, which is about gaming and gambling. So the first thing I think it's worth looking at is the similarities in the forms of harm. So they have a lot of, what would you say, a lot of crossover in terms of what makes them attractive, particularly to certain personalities in the way that they work. And we're talking here in both cases about types of gambling in particular where it's digital and it's one-on-one, it's one person with a machine, basically, are probably the main ones we think of. Though there's also now, of course, in e-sport type gambling, esports as video games, and video games generally where you're actually doing it in a group. However, the sort of things that I'll talk about today, what are these harms? Well, the first one, the obvious one that's a crossover, is costs in time. So people that have issues with either gambling or gaming will often be devoting inordinate amounts of time to them. The products themselves are designed to keep people playing. That's just basically built into the way that they're designed, of course, because they want to be popular, they want to attract people, and they want to keep them going. Increasingly for gaming, the way in which it's been monetized is to not as it used to be that you paid to buy the game and that was it, you walked away with it. Now, as with so many other things, they'd like you to have a subscription to it. They'd like to keep offering you things to buy during it that send money straight back to them. There's a lot of games that just have advertising in them where the game designer's hoping for a kickback if you actually go and buy something. But increasingly, the games tend to have purchases inside the game. Other things about them, they can be absorbing. So again, that can be a type of harm. We all know that if you get absorbed in anything, you know, I've found that at the moment I'm a little bit too absorbed in the Tour de France and I'm not going to bed at the right time. So it can be absorbing for all sorts of reasons. But again, it's taking you, to the degree that you're absorbed, you're often therefore losing some degree of control or perhaps balance in your life if it's a bad thing. The other thing is, both with gambling and gaming, we find quite a lot of people have issues at doing it because they're trying to escape other things. So it's a result of stress. There's often other comorbidities, things in their life that they're not comfortable with, or that they, and for that matter, when we think about adolescence, we know that one of the ways that adolescents grow up and deal with things that happen to them, a lot of changes happen to you when you're an adolescent. A lot of adolescents are very fond of repetition as a way of feeling safer and feeling in control. And of course, games offer you a lot of repetition. And for that matter, playing a pokies machine offers you a sort of form of repetition. The thing is that when we're talking about doing this to harmful levels, it might be distracting you from the issues. It might be pokies players who have gambling issues, gambling problems, will often talk about getting in the zone, being totally absorbed and feeling away from all of their problems. But of course, you're not absolving your problems. You're not resolving them at all when you're doing this. In fact, you might be compounding them because, again, you're wasting time or money. Which brings me to my next point, of course, is that the cost of money can be quite high. That's certainly the case for gambling, whether it be wagering, where in fact the stakes can be very high, so you can bet a lot of money. Well, there's a lot of money very quickly because you can bet a very large amount on a horse race or on a sporting event. And of course, with pokies, where the machine lets you bet every 2.14 seconds. Obviously, you can, even if you're betting with low amounts, you can lose a lot of money very quickly. So compared to going out to dinner or going to see a film or something, the amount of money you'll spend in 2 hours on those sort of activities can be much higher. And gaming, as I'll show you in a minute, can also become a very expensive business with these new in-game purchases being applied. And when we talk about harms, the Foundation commissioned a very good study on harm back in 2015, and then we did another one on social costs of harm from gambling in 2016, I think it was. And they found a lot of dimensions of harm, that is to say different areas of life that are affected, and then they found a whole bunch of harms within that. But again, there's a lot of overlap when I read literature about gaming harm. They're still there. So there's effects on your physical health, effects on your mental health, which can be anything from depression through to actual quite serious anxiety and various other mental health conditions. Effects on your relationships, basically, tending towards relationship breakdown or quarrelling or whatever. Again, think about all these things a little bit on a spectrum, I suppose. And if we think about how people that don't have these issues live their lives, and we count that and we said, oh, well, on an index, that's 100, people with issues are much, much lower. And that's the way we've studied harm at the Foundation. So we said, okay, so what's their standard of life like compared to somebody who doesn't have this issue? So it can affect their work, because obviously it distracts them from work. They're not necessarily present. In the case of gambling and high debts, sometimes it can even lead to stealing from work. Self-image is an important one. Interestingly enough, both in gaming and gambling, people that do it a lot, despite the fact that, say in gaming, there's often thought to be good effects on self-image, that's not always the case at all. There's the financial position the person is in both now and in the future. So that is to say, money that they need to be saving now to have a better life in the future isn't happening. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting that gets affected is housing. Housing stability. So we're not talking about necessarily roads to homelessness. In fact, homelessness comes up in most people's minds when they think about problem gambling. In fact, harm from gambling starts much earlier than that. And in fact, homelessness often operates as I don't have a problem because I'm not homeless. But just creating housing instability, creating the need to perhaps move house, perhaps not allowing someone to save up and get secure housing, affects them and also can affect their others. And again, a classic and I think often neglected effect of all of this is the effects that are had on children, which of course aren't just for a year or 2 years. If a child has interrupted schooling and that affects their whole educational career, that in turn impacts on their whole life. So there's those sorts of, there's some similarities in harm and gambling. So if you think about what are the key generators of risk, and I'll go through these reasonably quickly. The first thing, and it's true of both gaming and gambling, is access. So how available is it? How's it promoted? Is it promoted constantly? Again, when you've got an app on your phone, if you haven't set all the notifications off, then of course it's reminding you all the time, hey, why don't you come and play again? Or there's this opportunity or that opportunity. There's immersion, which I mentioned a little bit before. I've got some things there, obviously some points, so I won't read them out. And then the intensity is the other one. So the speed at which you can spend and how much you can spend at a time are really important generators of risk. So if you're looking at any particular product, those are the things that I would always say, run that ruler across it to see how it works. So again, if you look at a pokies, an EGM, highly accessible because they're located all over the place. There's 27,000 of them operating out in the suburbs. Immersion, yes, people get lost in them. Intensity, as I said before, you can bet very fast. The maximum bet in Victoria is $5, but $5 bet every 2.14 seconds is a lot of money that you can lose very quickly. Okay, so gaming and gambling, sort of the vectors of interaction. So what I'm talking about now are more the things that, for those of us that are interested in gambling and gambling issues, where gaming might be taking people towards gambling or might look like gambling. So the first one, and I think the most concerning, though at the moment the prevalence doesn't look very high in terms of how many people are participating in it, but and we're worried about that with COVID though, because of course the actual real pokies are shut. So simulated gambling games. So these are the things that look like a poker machine on your computer or whatever. Casino games, including poker, but again, they're not the real ones. So these are all ones that don't involve actually spending, betting money. So the thing about these is they're legal. You can go, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. You can go and download them, and in fact, they're often not age controlled. So you can download them. Many of them, in fact, you can download, and you can be. They might ask you, "Are you 13 years or older?" Some of them ask for 17, some of them ask for 15. But as far as I can tell, they don't have any way of you, because they're not taking any bank details from you. They don't actually have any way of knowing whether or not you actually are the age that you claim to be. Then there's also within those life games. You know, the virtual life games where you take on an avatar and whatever. Often there's virtual rewards within a game, and that can include gambling activities. I'm not sure just how prominent that is these days. In the research, it's not turning up as a big concern at the moment, but again, I haven't done a 100% survey to check that. I was more concerned with some other things for today. Then there's games that use features similar to EGMs. And this is the area where I think there's been the most concern recently. And what I mean by that is it works in a similar way on people's brains. So the psychologists and the psychiatrists tell us that they often use something called variable random reinforcement, whereby you get rewards randomly and not really in control, but you're just anticipating and waiting for that next reward. And that reward is in fact setting off centers of your brain that urge you to continue. And these games also are a bit like EGMs. It's very hard for anyone playing them to actually calculate the cost or the reward that they're getting for the cost versus the reward. So they're not sure, or they're not able to make a very rational calculation of what I'm actually paying for what I'm getting. The other one, using skins for gambling, I think for people that aren't familiar with gaming, that looks like a very odd term. Basically, in a lot of games, you can get a whole lot of little extra bits and pieces, like an extra costume or an extra hat or a super sword or something. And these can actually be traded with other players. And in fact, we have some concerns. Again, I think it's probably a small percentage, but it hasn't been studied that well, where teenagers might be using them to gamble. So rather than gamble money, they'll be engaged in a gambling game, but what the currency will be skins. So I've got 3 of these. So anyone that can remember swap cards or swapping things, it's a bit like how you might have used swap cards back in the playground in some sort of extra game where you gambled for them. That's not actually what happened with swap cards. Of course, you swap them, but they would have value because precisely because some swap cards were rarer than others, and so you might get 3 of one type of swap card for 1 of another. I hope people have enough of the same background as me to know what I'm talking about there. It's very hard not being able to see people's faces. Okay, so I've got a couple of quick case studies. The first one is about these simulated pokies games. Now this one here is called Lightning Link Casino Pokies. I pulled that off, I think the Apple Store the other day. That is actually ranked in the Google Store as in the top 20 games being downloaded. It's the highest grossing paid game. So it's making more money than any other game on the Google Store for the people that made it. And it's basically, and you can see there, what looks like a pokey reel, which is what it is, and how it appears on your actual phone. So you turn your phone sideways and you look at it that way. And then down next to that, I put down their in-app purchases list. So you can see, so what happens with this is you get a number of free credits. And I think with this one, with most of them certainly, you get free credits every day. But once you've used them up, and if you've become obsessed, you will use them up quite quickly, then you have to buy more credits if you want to keep playing. And you'll see there with coin package 11 and coin package 13, we're talking about $160 and $80 for those. Now, if you're somebody, and we know through our financial counsellors there have been people that have been really heavily into this, and have got into real trouble where they've been buying those coin packages every day. And we have one particular notorious case where someone lost well over $100,000 in a couple of months playing this game. So real damage in terms of expenditure. They ended up obviously having to see both financial counsellor and needing help. And thank goodness they went and looked for it. But so very serious. So that's these simulated pokies games. So at the moment with COVID, there was a worry that people would substitute. But what the surveys mostly seem to be coming back with is the people that played pokies didn't get the buzz from this that they were getting from pokies. So in fact, many of them might have tried it, but they haven't gone on to do it. But we'll await better surveys. But all the surveys we have so far are showing that it's not as bad as we thought it would be. So another case study, and I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly because I'm conscious of time. The Foundation made a submission to a Senate inquiry on loot boxes. Loot boxes now exist in lots and lots of video games. They're a way in which you can get a prize that might enhance your gameplay either by improving the look of your avatar, or it might be that it allows you to do better in the game. Now, one of the ways that you can get them is sort of through a lucky dip system, whereby you pay money and you can see in that picture that's there, the real spin, and when they come up, you might get nothing. Or in that case, if you've got 3 of what looks like a gun, if you had 3 of them, then you would win the gun. So you don't know what you're getting. And again, they spin and they look, and they don't all spin in reels. They have a lot of different things. Some have fireworks, some have spinning wheels that go around. But they work very much on variable random reinforcement. You don't know what you're going to get. So the cost of what you're getting compared to the reward is not clear. And they can be a bit obsessive. Now, again, on the positive side, I would say that by and large among gamers, surveys of gamers show that they hate them and they don't like them and they think they just get in the way, so they don't get into them. But at the same time, there are a small group of people who are really into them, to the point where you can go online and there will be people that stream their loot boxes. So they will actually allow you to watch them opening loot boxes. So there's a whole fandom for that. So there are issues with those. So what we did in that submission, and I'm going to skip through those slides when I get to them, was look at the way in which they compared to pokies. And obviously you can have access to these slides after the forum. So the key problems are those that people end up with a difficulty in stopping playing them. So very similar to the sort of gambling issues. And another thing, and this happens with gambling as well, another symptom, if you like, that someone has an issue is that they find it difficult to stop thinking about playing them. So they become obsessed with them, as you were. And the other final point that I've got there, which I think is the really important distinction with gaming compared to gambling, is it's not very regulated and it's quite accessible to minors. So, and I think that's where a lot of the community anxiety comes from, again, around all of this, because they're worried about the children. So what we did, and I'm just showing you these, I won't go through them. We did a comparison of the risk features compared to pokies. And again, the main thing that comes through here is how similar they are in many ways, but also the fact of how unregulated they are compared to Victoria. And I think one of the other things that's there, which is always a concern as we move into the digital world, is that ability of the algorithms of the machine that you're playing with to work out what you like and what you don't like, and to actually tailor its responses to you. So it can actually start encouraging play even more that way. At the moment, most of them are probably more working on what works for a general population. But just as Google is getting better and better and better at working out what to show you, so these things, the more you play them, have the potential ability to do the same thing. Okay, so there's a few other things. So just to finish with some points around loot boxes, a recent survey done for New South Wales found that 62% of popular video games now have loot boxes. So they're a concern, or they're definitely of interest because they're so prominent. And a third of those that they surveyed who'd played the games had made loot box purchases, and you can see there the median monthly expenditure. So that's the median. So there would have been people within that group that were spending a lot more money than that. And presumably that means there's a likelihood that some of them were spending more than they could afford and were incurring some level of harm. So to conclude, so a few points. So gaming into gambling, this has been a big issue probably for the entire of this century, really, which is when gaming really took off. So, and particularly once apps arrived with smartphones, which is I think about 2006. The research is only just beginning to catch up, but the good news is that the concern was kids will start playing gaming and they'll end up gambling. The pathways don't seem to be as strong as that. There's quite a strong distinction still between people who play games and people who gamble. So the crossover is not as high. There are concerns about the leading to gambling, which I've put there what some of them are. I think particularly the social games can act as practice. They educate people. They also normalise. So it's certainly the case that some of the surveys that have been done of young people around gaming show that they're more likely to have a positive attitude to gambling than the general population. The other thing I'd mention about gaming is, to the extent that we know a lot about who's participating in it, it's actually, interestingly enough, a bit of an ageing cohort. So the main people that are, the biggest bulge in people that are playing games are actually in their 30s, not in their teens or their 20s. So it depends how you ask the question. So if you ask the question, have you played a game in the last 12 months, the most simple question, and you tick, everyone who plays the game ticks a box, you get a different result to have you played a game in the last month, or do you play games on average at least once a month? You get something different. And that's where it skews a bit older than just the teenagers and the people in their early 20s. So overall, there isn't a great deal of evidence that gaming is a pathway for lots of people to gambling. However, what we do know is that gamers are more likely to be at risk of gambling issues than the general population. So gamers who take up gambling are more likely to. And if people have an issue with gambling or gaming, they will probably have an issue with the other as well if they do it. So that's a real tell for any of us that are out looking for what are the vulnerable populations, and sort of a warning. So if someone says, oh, I play games all the time, and then you find out that they gamble as well, then it would be very interesting to know what their gambling patterns are and ask them to think about it. So I've got some summary notes there, and then I'll finish because I think I'll run a little bit over. So gaming and gambling can cause issues related to loss of control. They can generate many similar harms. There are some pathways out of gaming that can lead to gambling. And that's, as I just said, someone who has issues with either gambling or gaming and engages in one and engages in both is likely to have issues in both. And I think I'll stop there because I think I've exhausted my time. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Tony.